I was sitting in the front row at my husband's funeral when my son stepped to the microphone and smiled. Dad made sure Mom will be cared for. We've already chosen a nice facility for her. My daughter-in-law added, we'll deal with the house on Monday. The chapel went silent. My husband had not even been buried yet. They were dividing my future. What they didn't know was that 3 days before dying, he had prepared something for them. Thank you for being here with me. Before we begin, drop a comment. Have you ever had to stand up for yourself against family expectations? Yes or no is fine. I read everyone, and your perspective matters. Just so you know, some details in this story have been adjusted for storytelling. What I hope you take away is the message behind it. At 69, standing in my bedroom mirror 2 weeks after burying the only man I ever loved, I looked like any other Ohio widow preparing for her husband's funeral, except I knew something my children didn't. The black dress I'd bought specifically for this day hung perfectly. Every other black dress in my closet held memories of happier occasions, anniversary dinners, theater nights. This one was sterile, appropriate for the sterile grief I was supposed to display for the cameras and distant relatives who would judge how well I was holding up. Russell Caldwell. My husband of 43 years stared back at me from the photo on our nightstand, a carpenter who built things to last. 3 days before he died, he'd gripped my hand with what little strength the cancer had left him and whispered, "Helen, we have prepared enough. Now we just have to wait." At the time, I thought he meant death, that we'd prepared our wills, our advance directives, all the paperwork that comes with the end of a life. But his eyes had held something else, a clarity that cut through the morphine haze. A plan I didn't fully understand yet. "Wait for what, Russell?" I asked the photo now. "You were talking about something else, weren't you?" The house felt enormous without him. 35 years of marriage, and suddenly I was rattling around in 3 bedrooms like a marble in an empty jar. Our children had barely visited during Russell's final weeks. Too busy, they said. Important work commitments. I understood. I'd raised them to be independent, successful people. I just hadn't realized I'd raised them to be strangers. Grace Lutheran Church was 12 minutes away. The October morning was unseasonably cold frost, still clinging to windshields in the parking lot. The maple trees had turned that brilliant amber Russell always loved. The chapel filled with Russell's colleagues from the carpentry workshop, neighbors, members of our congregation. Pastor Williams, who'd served Grace Lutheran for 8 years but barely knew my husband, would try to summarize a 35-year career in 5 minutes. 10 minutes before the service, my children still hadn't arrived. Then Vernon's BMW pulled into the parking lot. Vernon Caldwell, 40 years old and owner of Caldwell Fine Furniture, wore a tailored suit that probably cost more than I spent on groceries in 2 months. Beside him, Simone Caldwell, 38, my daughter-in-law and a real estate broker who assessed property values with the cold precision she now turned on me, clicked across the stone walkway in designer heels that echoed like judgment. Renee Lancaster, 35, and an elementary school teacher was my youngest, the one who used to crawl into bed with Russell and me during thunderstorms, who couldn't meet my eyes now as she trailed behind her siblings. They looked like success. Like everything Russell and I had worked toward during those lean years when we ate generic cereal for dinner so they could have name-brand lunch money. "We need to talk after the service, Mom," Vernon said, leaning down to kiss my cheek. His cologne was sharp expensive. "About Dad's arrangements. About practical matters." Practical matters. Even then, something cold settled in my stomach. The service passed in a blur of hymns I'd heard 1,000 times and condolences from people who kept calling Russell a good man. He was more than good. He remembered every anniversary, not just ours, but the children's first jobs, first apartments, first heartbreaks. He saved newspaper clippings about their achievements in a scrapbook he thought no one knew about. But good man would have to suffice. When Pastor Williams asked if anyone wanted to share memories, I expected one of my children to stand. They had so many stories, camping trips, where Russell taught them to tie knots Sunday mornings, when he made elaborate pancake breakfasts shaped like animals, the way he never missed a soccer game or school play. Instead, Vernon walked to the podium with boardroom confidence. Simone stepped forward to join him. "Thank you all for being here today," Vernon began. "Our father was a man who believed in family and tradition, in taking care of the people he loved. Dad worked hard his whole life to build something lasting. He wanted to make sure his family would be secure." Simone stepped closer to the microphone, her smile practiced and warm. "We found a very good place for Mom, with 24/7 care, quiet and fully equipped. She won't have to worry about anything anymore." The chapel murmured approval. Several people nodded. I heard someone whisper, "How thoughtful." Renee, still in her seat, nodded along. When did I raise them to be strangers? When did success teach them that love had an expiration date? You need to understand this wasn't grief making them awkward. This was calculation. This was a plan they'd rehearsed, a script I hadn't been given. Not one of them had asked what I wanted. They'd announced my disposal like a corporate restructuring right there in front of everyone who'd known me for decades. The chapel fell silent except for the soft hum of the ventilation system. Every eye in the room turned toward me, some curious, some pitying, some uncomfortable with the naked cruelty they'd just witnessed. I sat perfectly still, hands folded in my lap, my wedding ring cutting into my finger, where I'd been twisting it unconsciously. Nobody looked me in the eyes after that. Not Pastor Williams when he concluded the service. Not the funeral director when he offered his practiced condolences. Not my own children when they filed past to accept sympathy from guests who didn't quite know what to say anymore. As people began filing out, I heard the sharp click of Simone's heels on the stone floor. Her voice carried through the doorway, phone pressed to her ear, speaking quietly, but not quietly enough. "Can he come for the appraisal on Monday, perfect? The sooner we can move forward, the better." Monday. Russell's body wasn't even in the ground yet, and my daughter-in-law was already scheduling someone to assess the value of my home. But here's what she didn't know, what none of them knew. I had helped Russell write every word of what they were about to discover. The house felt enormous that night after everyone left 3 bedrooms, 1 widow, and a desk drawer I'd been waiting 2 weeks to open. Russell's study still smelled of wood oil and sawdust. The desk he'd built himself 30 years ago stood against the window, its surface cluttered with carpentry catalogs he'd never throw away. I sat in his chair, the leather still shaped to his body, and opened the bottom drawer. The blue plastic folder was exactly where he'd told me it would be labeled in his careful handwriting. Helen read alone. Inside were documents I recognized. Trust papers we'd reviewed together last March, financial records I'd helped organize, and a business card for Preston Mercer, the attorney who'd handled our affairs for 15 years. But on top was a handwritten note on Russell's workshop stationery, dated 3 days before he died. "Helen, if you're reading this, they said something at the funeral. I knew they would. Everything is ready. Call Preston Monday morning. Don't wait." My hands trembled holding the paper. Not from grief this time, but from something closer to vindication, mixed with rage. He'd known. Months ago, while I was still hoping our children would remember who raised them, Russell had seen exactly what was coming. "You knew," I whispered to the empty room. "You saw this coming and you prepared for it." The question that haunted me wasn't whether Russell had been right. It was whether I'd been willfully blind, choosing to believe our children were better than they'd turned out to be. I placed the folder back in the drawer and locked it. Monday morning, I would call Preston at 8 o'clock sharp, just like Russell instructed. But first, I needed to let my children show me exactly who they'd become. 3 days later, on Wednesday morning, I stood in my kitchen making cinnamon rolls from my mother's recipe, the one that required kneading the dough for exactly 10 minutes. The butter and cinnamon filled the house with warmth that felt like a lie. Vernon called first at precisely 10 o'clock. "Mom, we need to talk about the house situation," he said, his voice carrying that professional tone he used with difficult clients. "Leaving you alone in a place this big, it's not safe. What if you fell? What if something happened and nobody was there?" I kneaded the dough, feeling the resistance under my palms. "I've lived in this house for 43 years, Vernon. I know where every floorboard creaks." "I understand, but Dad would want us to make sure you're taken care of. The furniture business could help with estate matters, make this transition easier." "I'll think about it," I said, and ended the call before he could press further. Simone called at 11, her real estate broker's pitch polished smooth. "I've been researching Meadow Creek Assisted Living in Westlake," she said, as if this were a service she was providing, not a sentence she was delivering. "It has 24-hour nursing restaurant-style dining, even a beauty salon. Russell was so thoughtful planning ahead like this." The dough was almost ready. I shaped it into rolls, precise and even. "Russell never mentioned Meadow Creek to me," I said quietly. A pause. "Well, he probably didn't want to worry you, but it's all arranged. We just need to finalize the paperwork." "I see. Thank you for calling Simone." Renee's call came at noon, and unlike her siblings, my youngest daughter was crying. "I know this is hard, Mom," she said, her voice breaking. "It's hard for all of us, but we only want what's best for you. You understand that, don't you?" I placed the rolls in the oven and set the timer for 20 minutes. "Do I understand that you want what's best for me?" I repeated her words carefully. "Or do I understand that you've already decided what that is without asking me?" She didn't answer. After a long silence, she whispered, "I have to go," and hung up. I wasn't angry at them for calling. I was angry they thought I was stupid enough not to see exactly what they were doing. 3 coordinated calls in 2 hours, 3 different angles of attack, 3 children who'd apparently forgotten I'd taught them strategy when they were young enough to think checkers was complicated. Friday afternoon arrived with October sunlight that made everything look fragile and temporary. I was reading in the living room when I heard the sound of a truck in the driveway, followed by footsteps on the walkway. Howard Garrison. 72 appeared at my fence with a toolbox the way he'd done for 30 years. Russell's oldest friend, a retired carpenter, who knew more than he said. He didn't knock. He just started working on the loose section of fence that Russell had built in 1998, the one that separated our yard from the sidewalk. I made coffee and brought 2 cups out to the front porch. We sat on the steps in comfortable silence for a few minutes. 30 years of friendship doesn't need constant conversation. "Did Russell ever say anything to you?" I finally asked. "About the children, about what might happen after." "Russell worried about this fence a lot the last few months." Howard interrupted, his eyes on the street rather than on me. "Said it kept coming loose. Said some things need fixing before they break completely." I understood the metaphor. Russell had always spoken in wood and tools when emotions ran too close to the surface. He knew. Howard continued, still not looking at me. "He knew everything, Helen. That's why he called Preston in August." August. 2 months before Russell died, before the diagnosis had even turned terminal. Grief is a strange thing. It sharpens some senses while dulling others. Mine had sharpened into something close to prescience, or maybe just the clarity that comes when you finally stop hoping people will be better than they are. Howard finished his coffee, stood up, and returned to the fence. 20 minutes later, it was solid again. He packed his tools without a word, climbed into his truck, and drove away. I watched the dust settle where his truck had been, looking at the fence he'd just repaired, straight and solid, built to last another 20 years. Russell had once told me that Howard was the only person besides Preston who knew about the trust. At the time, I'd wondered why that mattered. Now, watching the empty street, I understood. Howard hadn't just been Russell's friend, he'd been his witness. And Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I would call Preston and learn exactly what my husband and his best friend had built together. Monday morning at 8 o'clock sharp, I called Preston Mercer's office. His secretary put me through immediately, as if he'd been expecting my call. Preston Mercer's office occupied the 3rd floor of a downtown Columbus building that had seen better decades. Preston 55 had handled our legal affairs for 15 years from this modest space. And when he spread Russell's trust documents across his desk that morning, I understood why my husband had chosen him. This was a man who built legal fortresses, not monuments. "Your husband was very thorough," Preston said, gesturing to the thick folder between us. The office smelled of old paper and fresh coffee sunlight filtering through blinds that needed dusting. "We started planning in February. By March, everything was in place." March. 6 months before Russell's diagnosis turned terminal. 7 months before he died. "Walk me through it one more time," I said, though we'd discussed every clause together while Russell was still strong enough to sit through meetings. "I want to make sure I understand what they're about to learn." Preston opened the folder with practiced efficiency. Russell transferred everything into the Living Trust 8 months ago. Living Trust bypasses probate cleaner faster, much harder to challenge. The assets were transferred in March, which establishes clear mental competency and intent. He wanted the video and Howard's signature done later in August, once he understood exactly what he was protecting you from. He pulled out a thick stack of documents. "Your husband had 3 independent psychiatric evaluations in August, all confirming full mental capacity. I have a notarized video of Russell reading every clause of the trust aloud, explaining his reasoning. 4 cameras, 3 witnesses present, dated August 18th. "And Howard?" I asked. Preston placed another document on the desk. "Howard Garrison's notarized witness signature, also August 18th. He has no financial interest in the estate, has known Russell for 3 decades, and signed an affidavit confirming that Russell was of sound mind and acting without coercion." I looked at the signature, Howard's careful handwriting, the notary seal, the date. Russell had thought of everything. "What if Simone hires a lawyer?" I asked, though I already knew the answer. Preston's expression didn't change, but something that might have been satisfaction flickered in his eyes. He opened another file, this one even thicker. "Let her try. Ohio trust law is very clear. We have documented mental competency video testimony, independent witnesses, and an 8-month gap between execution and death. Any challenge would be expensive and futile." He leaned back in his chair. "The 90-day forfeiture window is the hammer. If they violate any condition in the first 3 months, they lose everything immediately. After that, it goes to standard enforcement slower, but still binding. Wednesday, I said, the formal reading. Wednesday, Preston confirmed. I'll schedule it for 10 in the morning. That gives them time to arrange their schedules, but not enough time to coordinate strategy. 2 days later, I sat in Preston's conference room, watching my children arrive. The room was smaller than I'd expected, with a round table instead of the imposing rectangular one you see in movies. Somehow that made it worse. There was nowhere to hide. Vernon arrived first, carrying a leather portfolio that probably contained notes on how to divide the estate efficiently. Simone followed with a legal pad questions already written down in her precise handwriting. Renee came last, silent and pale, taking the seat farthest from me. Preston waited until everyone was settled, then opened the trust document with the ceremony of someone who knew he was about to detonate a bomb. I'll read the relevant sections, he said, his voice professionally neutral. All real and personal property of Russell Caldwell transfers to Vernon Caldwell and Renee Lancaster jointly to be managed by mutual agreement according to the terms outlined in... Simone was already smiling. Vernon made a small check mark on his legal pad. Renee stared at her hands. However, Preston continued, and I watched Simone's pen still on the page. These bequests come with mandatory conditions under the living trust effective immediately. The word, however, hung in the air like a held breath. You need to understand, the moment they walked into that conference room, they thought they were attending a formality. What they didn't know was that Russell had turned their inheritance into a loyalty test, and the exam was already graded. Condition 1, Preston read, monthly care payment of $8,000 to Mrs. Helen Caldwell to be split equally between beneficiaries. Payment due first of each month in perpetuity or until Mrs. Caldwell's death. Vernon's pen stopped moving. Condition 2. The family home at Westerville shall not be sold, leased, or encumbered while Mrs. Caldwell lives, and she retains full residential rights regardless of title transfer. Simone's smile had frozen into something that looked like it hurt. Condition 3. Mrs. Caldwell shall not be placed in any institutional care facility without her express written consent witnessed and notarized. Renee looked up at me, for the first time her eyes wide. Condition 4, Preston said, his voice hardening slightly. Violation of any condition during the first 90 days results in immediate and total forfeiture. All assets transfer to the Ohio Youth Carpentry Vocational Training Fund. No court approval is required to trigger the forfeiture. Any appeal would have to prove the trustee acted in bad faith, a high bar this paperwork was built specifically to avoid. Mr. Preston Mercer serves as independent trustee with sole discretion to determine compliance. I watched Vernon's face as the mathematics sank in. $8,000 a month, $96,000 a year. For however long I lived, 10 years, 2030. Nearly $3 million if I reached my mother's age of 99. More than the entire estate was worth. The workshop was valued at $150,000, the house at $180,000. The supply contracts and equipment maybe another $50,000. They stood to inherit roughly $380,000, but only if they paid me $96,000 every year for potentially 3 decades. The silence in that conference room was absolute. Even the building's heating system seemed to hold its breath. Simone set her pen down on the table. The small click of plastic on wood sounded like a gunshot in the quiet. When she spoke, her voice was perfectly controlled, professional, the real estate broker accustomed to negotiating terms. Can this be challenged? Preston looked at me for exactly 1 second before he answered. In that look past everything, Russell and I had spent 8 months building every evaluation, every video, every witness signature, every legal precedent we'd researched together during his final months. I sat in my car in Preston's parking lot for 20 minutes after the meeting ended, watching Vernon's SUV pull away Simone's sedan, following close behind. The blue folder rested on my passenger seat, but my fingers trembled around a smaller envelope Preston had handed me at the door. From Russell, he'd said quietly. Instructions were to give it to you after the first reading. I tore it open. Helen, if you're reading this, Preston just told you about the trust conditions, and our children are likely furious. I need you to know why I wrote them that way. August 12th, 3 weeks before my diagnosis, I was replacing the fence boards Howard ordered. Around 2 p.m., I saw Simone's car parked across the street. She got out with her phone, took pictures of our house front door garage, the garden, then walked the property line taking notes. She didn't knock, didn't call, just documented everything like she was preparing an inventory. I didn't tell you because I thought I was being paranoid. Then the diagnosis came. and I understood. They were already planning. The conditions aren't punishment, sweetheart. They're protection. Trust your instincts. All my love, Russell. My hands shook so hard the paper rattled. August 12th. Russell had been alive, healthy enough to build fence panels, and Simone was already circling our property like a vulture evaluating a carcass. I looked up just as a silver sedan slowed in front of Preston's building. Simone's car. She'd circled back without Vernon, and she was doing it again, phone raised, photographing the law office entrance, probably documenting my car, maybe planning to question how long I'd stayed or whether I was competent enough to drive myself home. I grabbed my own phone and started recording. I captured her taking 6 photos, zooming in on my license plate, then checking something on her phone. Probably notes, probably building her case that I needed supervision. When she finally drove away, I had 4 minutes of clear video time-stamped, geotagged. Russell had seen the truth. Now I had proof it never stopped. The next morning, all 3 of my children appeared on my doorstep at 9:15. No call ahead, no text warning. Vernon carried a leather portfolio that looked expensive and rehearsed. Renee held a bakery box from the German village place I used to love, back when surprise visits meant affection instead of strategy. Mom. Vernon started that corporate voice he used in boardroom negotiations. We need to talk about yesterday. We handled things poorly. I let them in because refusing would become evidence of hostility. They arranged themselves in my living room like a presentation panel, Vernon in Russell's chair. Simone perched on the sofa arm, Renee unpacking apple fritters nobody would eat. We were shocked, Simone said, that therapist voice oozing manufactured empathy. The trust conditions felt like an attack, and we reacted emotionally. But we've had time to think, and we want to apologize. Vernon opened his portfolio. We put together a care plan. Nothing legal, nothing binding, just a family agreement that addresses Dad's concerns while making sure you're supported. He slid a spiral-bound document across my coffee table. 23 pages, tabs in different colors, an executive summary on cream cardstock. I didn't touch it. When did you make this? Last night, Renee said quickly. We stayed up late working on it together. 23 pages since yesterday afternoon. I let the question hang. With color-coded tabs and professional binding, Vernon's jaw tightened. Simone examined her manicure. Or did you make it before the trust reading? I pulled out my phone, opened my photos, found the screenshot I'd taken of our text history. Vernon, you sent me a message 2 weeks ago asking about my daily routine and whether I had trouble with bills. Simone, you asked if I'd considered simplifying my living situation. That was before Russell's conditions were even read aloud. The silence felt like vindication. This care plan, I continued flipping through pages I refused to read carefully, has sections on medication management, financial oversight, and residential options. It references concerns about my judgment and decision-making capacity. You wrote this before you knew about the trust. You were already building a case. Vernon stood. Mom, you're being paranoid. Russell saw Simone photographing our house in August, I said, 3 weeks before his diagnosis. He wrote me a letter about it, and yesterday after the trust reading, I watched her do it again outside Preston's office. I have video. Simone went pale. Renee looked at her sister with something between confusion and horror. The trust conditions aren't punishments, I said, standing now, taking control of my own living room. They're requirements. You want access to your inheritance? Then you'll follow your father's instructions. You'll wait 6 months. You'll prove you care about me, not my assets. And you'll do it knowing I'm documenting everything. I walked to the door and opened it. The apple fritters were a nice touch, I said. But next time you want to visit your mother, try calling first, like people who actually care. They left without the portfolio. I locked the door behind them, then photographed every page of their care plan. 23 pages of evidence that they'd been planning this long before Russell's conditions gave them a reason to pretend otherwise. My phone buzzed. A text from Preston Judge approved expedited competency evaluation. Appointment scheduled for next week. Are you ready? I looked at the care plan documentation spread across my table, Russell's letter in my hand, and the video evidence on my phone. I texted back, let them bring it. 3 weeks after this trust reading, I called Vernon on a Saturday morning and asked him to repaint the fence his father had built in 1998, the same fence Howard had just fixed, the one that didn't actually need repainting yet. Bring outdoor latex paint, I told him. White. The hardware store will know which type for weathered wood. He arrived at 8:30 wearing khakis and a polo shirt, business casual, like he was meeting clients instead of painting 70 feet of fence in November cold. No drop cloths, no painter's tape. The paint cans he unloaded from his Audi were interior latex $20 contractor grade that would peel before spring. I didn't correct him. I made coffee, filled a thermos with water, and settled into the porch chair Russell used to occupy on weekends back when he'd supervise neighborhood kids doing yard work for summer money. Vernon painted like a man checking items off a list. Long vertical strokes that left drips. Sections where the coverage thinned because he didn't reload the brush. Corners where he angled wrong and hit the post instead of the rail. He worked fast the way he probably ran quarterly reports, efficient on paper, sloppy in execution. Across the fence line, Howard pruned his rose bushes with deliberate slowness, watching. 3 hours in, Vernon straightened, rolling his shoulders. Paint speckled his polo light blue, with the furniture store logo embroidered on the chest. "Is there anything else that needs doing, Mom? Any other projects Dad used to handle?" "Just the fence today," I said, refilling his water glass from the thermos. He finished by 2 o'clock. 5 hours total. The fence looked painted the way a child's drawing looks, complete, technically covered, but missing the craft that made Russell's work last decades. Vernon loaded his brushes into a plastic grocery bag, wiped his hands on a rag, and stood back to survey his work with visible satisfaction. Howard set down his pruning shears and approached the fence line, examining the rails Vernon had just coated. He ran a fingertip along the wood, testing the texture, then looked at me across the yard. "Not the right kind of paint for this wood," Howard said quietly, his 72-year-old voice carrying just far enough. "Won't last the winter. Russell always used oil-based for outdoor work, but the boy tried." Vernon's face went red, not from cold or exertion, but from the specific shade of humiliation that comes from failing a test you didn't know you were taking. "I know," I told Howard, "but this is the boy's effort." Vernon drove away without asking what else I might need painted. Russell used to say, you could tell everything about a man by how he treated wood, whether he rushed or took his time, whether he read the grain or fought against it. Vernon had fought, and the fence showed it. But effort mattered more than outcome in the Trust's 6-month timeline, and I'd documented his 5 hours with photos time-stamped every 30 minutes. A week later, Vernon called asking permission to inventory the workshop. "For business planning," he explained. "I need to understand Dad's supplier relationships, contract obligations, asset valuation for the store." I drove to Grove City on Thursday afternoon and unlocked the workshop door, the building Russell had leased in 1985, back when our children were small and carpentry meant survival instead of legacy. The smell hit me first: sawdust and linseed oil, the scent of 38 years of measuring twice and cutting once. Vernon had already started. File boxes lined the workbench, supply catalogs stacked by year, order forms in chronological piles. He worked through Russell's organization system, the way archaeologists excavate ruins, carefully destroying the logic that had made it functional. "There's a filing cabinet in the office," I said, pointing to the back room Russell used for paperwork. "Contracts are in the bottom drawer." I wasn't trying to humiliate Vernon. I was teaching him what Russell had tried to teach him 30 years ago, that the invisible work matters most. That business isn't just craftsmanship and sales, but the 1,000 administrative decisions that keep tools sharp and suppliers loyal. That someone has to read contracts, negotiate terms, and sign the renewals that make everything else possible. 20 minutes later, Vernon emerged from the office holding a file folder. His expression caught between confusion and something that looked like betrayal. "You signed this," he said, not quite a question. "You've been signing the workshop contracts since 2014. I thought Dad handled all the business." "Your father ran the workshop," I said. "I handled the paperwork. We divided responsibilities that way from the beginning. Someone had to negotiate terms, track invoices, maintain vendor relationships." He opened the folder on the workbench. Morrison Construction Supply, 10-year agreement, $45,000 annual revenue, signed September 2014. Every yearly renewal bore the same signature line: Helen Caldwell, Financial Administrator, Caldwell Carpentry. The extension clause sat in the middle of page 3, single paragraph, legally airtight, renewal valid only upon signature of Mrs. Helen Caldwell or court-appointed successor. Vernon's finger traced the numbers. $45,000 per year. 40% of the furniture store's material supply, the hardwood stock specialty hardware finishing compounds that made his custom pieces possible, all flowing through a contract I controlled. "This expires in March," Vernon said, his corporate negotiation voice returning. "Will you sign the renewal extension?" I set my coffee cup on the workbench right next to the contract that proved I'd been running half of Russell's business while my children assumed I only answered phones and balanced checkbooks. "March is a long way off, Vernon," I said. "We'll see how things are going by then." He stared at me across the workshop table, Morrison Construction's letterhead catching the fluorescent light. $45,000 a year, 40% of his material supply, renewable only with my signature. And I meant it because between now and March, I had other tests to administer, other layers of my children's assumptions to peel away other invisible work to make suddenly devastatingly visible. Vernon left the workshop that Thursday with more questions than answers. The Morrison Construction contract still spread across the workbench. I locked the door behind him, thinking about the other tests Russell had designed. Simone arrived at exactly 9:45 the following Tuesday morning, 15 minutes before my appointment with Dr. Fletcher, precisely the buffer time recommended for downtown Columbus traffic, and I knew before she opened her car door that I was about to be tested. She wore a camel wool coat and leather gloves, the understated elegance real estate brokers use for million-dollar showings. She opened my passenger door before I reached the driveway, checked her watch as I settled in, merged into traffic with practiced efficiency. "Traffic looks good," she said. "We'll be early." In the waiting room, she scrolled through work emails that required immediate attention, even on a Tuesday morning when she'd volunteered to drive her mother-in-law to a doctor's appointment. Her thumbs moved across the screen with mechanical precision. Dr. Fletcher, my family physician for 12 years, conducted the quarterly checkup with the same thorough efficiency he'd shown since Russell and I first switched to his practice. Blood pressure reflexes, balance tests, standard medication questions. "May I join you for the consultation?" Simone asked, appearing in the exam room doorway with a smile that looked borrowed from a training manual. Dr. Fletcher glanced at me. I nodded. Simone sat in the chair Russell used to occupy, pulled out her phone, and transformed into clinical interviewer. "Dr. Fletcher, I want to make sure I understand Mom's care needs," she said, that therapist voice smooth as rehearsed testimony. "Current medications, are any dosages changing? Should we watch for specific side effects? Any specialist referrals needed? Memory concerns, balance issues that might require adaptive equipment." Not questions from concern, questions from strategy. The kind an attorney asks before building a case, the kind a real estate broker asks before listing a property. The kind a daughter asks when gathering evidence for arguments about competency and living arrangements, and whether her mother-in-law should really be living alone. Dr. Fletcher answered each question with patient professionalism. My vitals were stable, my medications unchanged, my cognitive function normal, no concerns, no referrals, no adaptive equipment needed. Simone typed every word into her phone. In the car returning to Westerville, she asked, "Do you need anything else, Mom? Any medical equipment for the house, grab bars in the bathroom, a medical alert system? We want to make sure you're safe." I watched her profile while she drove and saw the real estate broker calculating square footage, measuring room dimensions, estimating renovation costs for a property she planned to list by spring. "No, Simone," I said. "Thank you for asking." We both smiled. We both knew exactly what this was. I know what you're thinking. Why let her drive me? Why accept the help? Because tests only work when the subject doesn't know they're being tested. I needed documentation of every hollow performance, every calculated question, every moment they pretended concern while building their case. Before I show you what Vernon discovered in Russell's workshop, drop your guess in one sentence. What do you think my husband left inside that locked wooden box? Please note the next part includes fictionalized details added for emotional impact. The lesson is what I hope stays with you. A week later, Vernon called asking to inventory the workshop again. There might be other contracts, other supplier agreements I need to understand before March. I met him there on a cold Thursday afternoon. Vernon worked through filing cabinets with systematic thoroughness, searching for leverage for hidden assets, for anything that might shift the balance of power back. He found the wooden box under the raw lumber rack in the far corner, tucked behind cherry planks Russell had been aging for a custom dining table he never got to build. Small box, maybe 8 inches square, self-built from walnut brass hinge, the kind of craftsmanship Russell put into everything. The lid bore 2 letters carved into the wood, R.C. Russell's initials done in his own hand. Locked. Vernon shook it gently. Something heavy shifted inside the sound of papers. "Mom, do you know about this box?" His voice carried that edge of discovery. "It's locked. Could be important papers, maybe property deeds not listed in the trust." I walked over and pulled a small brass key from my coat pocket. I'd carried it since August transferred it from jacket to jacket, coat to coat, keeping it close the way Russell had asked. Vernon stared. You had the key this whole time. Your father gave me this key in August, I said. The month before he died. Before his diagnosis, before any of us knew how little time was left. This box is for me, Vernon. I unlocked it, lifted the lid just enough to see inside. Not documents, not deeds, but letters in Russell's handwriting, photographs from 43 years of marriage, and something wrapped in cloth I recognized immediately. I closed the lid before Vernon could see. What's inside? He asked. That's between your father and me, I said, tucking the box under my arm. He asked me to wait until Christmas to look through it properly, so I will. That night, I sat at my kitchen table with the wooden box in front of me, Russell's initials catching the overhead light, RC, carved by his own hand probably decades ago. I could have opened it. I could have read his letters, examined whatever he'd wrapped, so carefully discovered what my husband wanted me to know last. But Russell had asked me to wait until Christmas Day, and after 43 years of marriage, I knew how to honor his requests, even after he was gone. 2 more weeks until I'd discover what Russell had saved for last, what final truth he wanted revealed, only after I'd administered all the other tests gathered, all the other evidence proven to myself, and to whatever judgment might come, that I'd done exactly what he'd asked. I hadn't cooked chicken stewed with potatoes in 3 years, not since the last time Renee came to dinner before her life got too busy for her mother. But when she called asking if we could talk just the 2 of us, I knew exactly what to make. The wooden box still sat on my kitchen table where I'd placed it 10 days earlier. 2 more weeks until Christmas. 2 more weeks until I'd open it. But tonight wasn't about Russell's final message. Tonight was about my youngest daughter, and whether anything genuine remained beneath the layers of family loyalty and financial calculation. Renee's car pulled into the driveway at exactly 6 o'clock on that Friday evening in early December. I watched from the kitchen window as she sat behind the wheel for almost 3 minutes before finally opening the door the way people do when they're rehearsing conversations they're afraid to have. She walked to my front door slowly, shoulders tight, unable to meet my eyes when I opened it. "Come in," I said. "Dinner's ready." The chicken stew smelled the way it had for 40 years, onions and thyme, and the particular richness that comes from cooking meat low and slow until it falls apart at the touch of a fork. My mother taught me this recipe when Renee was born, back when I was learning how to feed a family on a carpenter's wages. Renee had requested it every birthday until she turned 16 and decided she was too sophisticated for comfort food. We ate quietly at first. Small talk about her elementary school, the 4th grade class she was teaching this year, the holiday concert they were planning. Safe topics, neutral ground, the kind of conversation you have with acquaintances instead of family. I served apple pie for dessert. She ate 3 bites before her fork clattered against the plate and her defenses finally cracked. "I know I was wrong," she said, her voice shaking in a way I hadn't heard since she was small. "I shouldn't have let Vernon and Simone make that announcement without asking you first. I should have stood up for you at the funeral. I should have questioned their plans instead of just going along. I'm truly sorry, Mom." I set my own fork down, carefully, looked at my youngest daughter, 35 years old, elementary school teacher, mother to my only grandchild, and saw genuine tears forming in her eyes. Not the calculated emotion Simone performed so well. Not the strategic regret Vernon deployed when negotiating better terms. Real tears from real remorse. The first crack in my children's united front. The first authentic apology I'd received since Russell died. "Thank you for saying that," I said. She nodded, wiped her eyes with her napkin, started to speak again, probably to explain, to justify, to rebuild the comfortable distance apologies create when they're accepted too quickly. I stopped her with a question. "Do you miss me, Renee?" I asked gently, my voice without anger or accusation. "Or do you miss the inheritance portion?" She opened her mouth, closed it, opened it again, and no words came. I didn't ask that question to be cruel. I asked it because I needed to know if she understood what she'd lost when she chose her siblings over her mother. If she recognized the difference between regret for hurting someone and regret for losing access to something valuable. If any part of her arrival tonight was about me instead of about money. The tears that fell then weren't from my question. They were from the realization visible on her face, like watching someone see their reflection clearly for the first time, that she couldn't distinguish between the two. That somewhere in the past 3 years, the lines had blurred so completely, she didn't know which loss hurt more. The silence stretched between us like the 43 years of motherhood that had brought us to this kitchen table, this moment, this unanswerable question. Finally, I stood and began clearing the dessert plates. "Staying for tea?" I asked. She looked up at me through tears, surprised by the invitation after such devastating honesty. "Yes," she whispered. "Please." I made chamomile the way she liked it, 1 sugar, no milk. And we sat in my living room with cups warming our hands while December cold pressed against the windows. And we talked, really talked, not about money or trusts or 6-month conditions, not about Vernon's furniture store or Simone's real estate contracts or the monthly payments they resented providing. We talked about her students, about a 7-year-old boy who struggled with reading, how she'd started staying late twice a week to work with him one-on-one, how his face lit up last Tuesday when he finally decoded a whole paragraph by himself, about teaching strategies and patience and hope, about Iris, about 4-year-old questions and developmental milestones and the exhausting joy of motherhood. For 30 minutes, neither of us mentioned money. It was the first time in years I'd heard my daughter's voice without calculation behind it. The first time she'd talked about her life instead of her position, her students instead of her strategy, her daughter instead of her inheritance portion. She left at 9 o'clock, hugged me at the door with arms that felt less rehearsed than they had at Russell's funeral. I watched her taillights disappear down the street, then returned to my kitchen table. The wooden box sat where I'd left it. Next to it, I placed my journal, the one I'd kept since Russell died, recording every phone call, every test, every documented moment. I wrote the date, December 12th, 2023. First real conversation with Renee in 3 years. She stayed for tea. I don't know what this means, but I recorded it. I didn't know if tonight meant redemption or just another performance my daughter had finally learned to execute convincingly. I didn't know if the tears were genuine or strategic, if the conversation was connection or calculation. But 10 days later, I would get my answer when Simone tried one final legal challenge and discovered exactly how prepared Russell and I had been. Simone arrived at Preston Mercer's office 10 days after my dinner with Renee, flanked by a Cleveland attorney carrying a leather briefcase thick with precedent cases. And for the first time since the trust reading, I saw something close to triumph in her eyes. She'd found her weapon. She'd done her research. She believed she'd discovered the legal weakness that would crack Russell's fortress open. "This is Bradford Whitfield," Simone said, gesturing to the man beside her 50-something sharp charcoal suit, the kind of confident posture that comes from winning arguments in expensive courtrooms. Trust law specialist from Cleveland with 15 years' experience in estate litigation. Whitfield shook Preston's hand, then mine, and arranged his materials on the conference table with practiced efficiency, legal pads, tabbed binders, a laptop already open to relevant case law. "I've reviewed the Caldwell Living Trust extensively." Whitfield began, his voice carrying the authoritative tone of someone accustomed to judges listening carefully. "The 90-day forfeiture clause constitutes unconscionable duress under Ohio Revised Code, Section 5802.03. No reasonable beneficiary can comply with such conditions. The clause creates undue influence on heirs, violates public policy regarding family support obligations, and exceeds permissible testamentary restrictions." He opened the first binder, sliding photocopied cases across the table. "Ohio courts have consistently overturned punitive trust provisions. Estate of Morrison 2018 forfeiture clause requiring monthly visits ruled unconscionable. Reynolds Trust 2015 financial penalty provisions deemed contrary to public policy. Patterson Family Trust 2019 conditional inheritance based on behavioral compliance struck down as undue influence." Simone nodded along her therapist face, replaced by something harder, more calculating. She'd brought precedent. She'd brought expertise. She believed she was about to win. Preston listened calmly, taking notes with the same measured patience he'd shown at every meeting. When Whitfield finished his 15-minute presentation, complete with citations, legal analysis, and recommended remediation, Preston opened a thick file folder that had been sitting beside him the entire time. "Mr. Whitfield, I appreciate your thorough research," Preston said. "However, I have documentation you may want to review before proceeding." He placed the first document on the table. A DVD case with a handwritten label, Russell Caldwell Trust Video Testimony, August 18th, 2023. 4 cameras, 3 witnesses. Mr. Caldwell recorded a notarized video statement explaining every clause of his trust, the reasoning behind each condition, and his mental state at the time of creation. 4 camera angles. 3 independent witnesses present during recording, dated 6 weeks before his cancer diagnosis. The second document, a medical report on letterhead from 3 different psychiatric practices. 3 independent psychiatric evaluations conducted in August 2023, all confirming mental competency, absence of duress, and cognitive capacity to execute complex legal instruments. The third document, cognitive assessment, results neurological testing, mental status examinations. And finally, the document that made Simone's confident expression freeze a single sheet of paper with 2 signatures and a notary seal. Witness affidavit from Howard Garrison, dated August 18, 2023. Mr. Garrison is a retired carpenter who knew Russell Caldwell for 30 years, has no financial interest in the estate, and was present during the trust's execution. His testimony confirms Russell's clarity of purpose, absence of coercion, and explicit intent regarding every condition. You need to understand I didn't feel triumph when Simone's face went pale. I didn't feel victorious when Whitfield spent the next 10 minutes reviewing documents in stone-faced silence. I felt tired. Vindication tastes like ashes when you have to prove your own children tried to discard you. Whitfield whispered something to Simone I couldn't hear. Her confident expression cracked like ice over deep water. She stood abruptly, chair scraping against floor, and walked out of the conference room mid-meeting. No goodbye, no explanation, just the click of expensive heels retreating down the hallway. Whitfield closed his briefcase with careful precision. Mr. Mercer, Mrs. Caldwell, I apologize for the misunderstanding. This documentation is... He paused, choosing words carefully. Ironclad. Challenging this trust would be expensive and futile. The meeting was over in 35 minutes. Over the following 2 weeks, I observed consequences rippling through the Columbus suburbs, the way news travels in small towns not through investigation, but through the ordinary channels of community gossip and unavoidable observation. Vernon laid off 2 employees from his furniture store. I heard about it from the bakery cashier whose cousin worked there. Both men had faces I recognized from Russell's carpentry days back when my husband mentored young woodworkers who couldn't afford formal training. Simone's 8-month-old SUV disappeared from her driveway, replaced by an older sedan. I noticed while driving past their street on my way to Howard's for coffee. The real estate broker who'd calculated my square footage now drove a car with rust around the wheel wells. Renee called on a Wednesday afternoon to chat about Iris's preschool program. Halfway through the conversation, she mentioned casually, I postponed the house purchase. The timing wasn't right, maybe next year. Indefinitely, she meant, maybe never. The Sunday calls began that week. Speakerphone conferences with all 3 children together. Voices professionally polite, emotionally hollow as prepared statements. Mom, do you need anything this week? Vernon asked with the same tone he probably used confirming furniture delivery schedules. Groceries, home maintenance, medical appointments. No thank you, I said. Okay, we'll check in Sunday. Click. The Sunday calls became ritual. Professional, polite, hollow as church bells in an empty chapel. They were caring for me exactly the way they'd care for a difficult client with efficiency and minimum emotional investment meeting obligations without offering anything resembling affection. I didn't feel happiness watching the consequences unfold. I didn't even feel satisfaction, just the quiet recognition that this was what had to happen, the natural result of choices they'd made freely, the price of assumptions they'd held without question. December deepened toward Christmas. The wooden box still sat on my kitchen table where I'd placed it 3 weeks earlier. Waiting. December 25th arrived like any other winter morning in Ohio. Gray sky pressing against windows, frost painting patterns on glass coffee, brewing in an empty house that smelled of pine from the small tree I'd decorated alone. The wooden box sat on my kitchen table where it had been for 3 weeks, Russell's initials catching the morning light. Today was the day he'd asked me to open it. Inside was everything I needed to understand about what my husband had really left behind. The Christmas tree I'd put up was smaller than any we'd had in 43 years. A 4-foot tabletop pine with white lights that reflected off empty rooms, and the gingerbread cooling on the kitchen counter was the first batch I'd baked since Russell died. The wooden box still sat on the table, where it had waited for 3 weeks. But Christmas morning began in silence. Vernon and Simone had sent cards with generic winter scenes and printed signatures. No visit. No phone call. At 2 o'clock that afternoon, my phone buzzed with a text from Renee. Can Iris and I come over? She wants to see your Christmas tree, if you're not busy. Not a scheduled Sunday call. Not an obligation. A genuine request. I texted back, please come. They arrived at 3 o'clock. Iris Lancaster, barely 4 years old with her mother's dark hair and her grandfather's curious eyes, ran straight to my Christmas tree. She stopped suddenly, small hands reaching toward the white lights, and turned to look at me with that particular seriousness children use when asking important questions. Grandma, where is Grandpa? Mommy said he's in heaven now. The first honest question anyone had asked in months. No calculation behind it, no strategy, just a child trying to understand why her grandfather wasn't here. I knelt to her eye level, took her small hands in mine. "Grandpa is in a very beautiful place, sweetheart," I said. "But he told Grandma something important before he left. He told me to take very good care of you." Iris nodded with that 4-year-old solemnity that looks like wisdom. I stood and tears fell. Not from pain, but from the sudden realization that this innocent child deserved better than the family reality we'd created, better than adults who confused inheritance with love, better than legal fortresses built against your own children. Renee sat down beside me on the couch and placed her hand over mine. We stayed for 2 hours. No talk of money or trusts or conditions. Iris played with the tree ornaments. Renee and I drank chamomile tea and talked about Iris's preschool Christmas program, about gingerbread houses made in class, about traditions worth preserving. Real conversation. The kind mothers and daughters have when they remember their mothers and daughters first. They left at 5 o'clock, Iris hugging me goodbye with sticky hands that smelled like gingerbread cookies. After they left, the house felt different. Not less empty, but less hollow. There's a difference between being alone and being abandoned. For the first time in months, I felt the former instead of the latter. At 9 o'clock that evening, I sat at my kitchen table with the wooden box and opened it alone. 3 items inside: no money, no property deeds, no bank statements or investment portfolios. The first item was a photo album, printed photographs in a hand-bound book Russell must have assembled himself. Each photo had a caption written on the back in his carpenter's handwriting recording the date and emotion he wanted remembered. Vernon's college graduation 2005. Caption on back, Vernon's college graduation 2005. Helen and I saved for 15 years so he could graduate debt-free, worth every generic brand dinner we ate. Renee's first day of kindergarten 1993, tears streaming down her face. Caption, Renee's first day kindergarten. She cried. Helen told her teachers were just new friends waiting to meet her. 43 years of marriage documented in photographs and handwritten memory. The second item was a ledger. Family expenses, 1989 to 2023, every income source and expenditure recorded by hand. But it was the final column on each page that made my breath catch a notation, repeated month after month, year after year. H approved. H for Helen. Every major decision, every budget adjustment, every financial choice that built the comfortable life our children took for granted. Russell had documented my approval because I hadn't just managed our household, I'd been the financial architect of everything. 34 years of proof on every page. The box wasn't about proving I'd been right. It was about showing them who their mother had been all along, not the invisible homemaker who answered phones and balanced checkbooks, but the financial partner who'd approved every decision that sent Vernon to college debt-free, that bought Renee's first car, that saved enough for retirement while building a carpentry business from nothing. The third item was a sealed envelope, heavy cream cardstock with Russell's handwriting across the front, to my children. Not a legal document, not part of the trust Preston had read, something personal, something private between a father and the people he'd raised. I didn't open it. It belonged to them. I sat with these 3 items for an hour, photographs and ledgers, and a letter I would never read, understanding finally what Russell had been building all along. Not just legal protection, not just tests of character, but documentation of truth. At 10 o'clock, I picked up my phone and composed a text to all 3 children. "Next week, I want to see you. All 3. I have something from your father to give, not the trust, something else, something you need to see." I set Russell's photo, the one from our 40th anniversary, both of us gray-haired and smiling next to the wooden box, both bathed in yellow light from the small Christmas tree. Inside that sealed envelope was Russell's final message to our children, not the legal lecture they'd heard at the trust reading, but something personal, something I hadn't read and wouldn't. I didn't know what it said, but 1 month later, when I gave it to them, I would finally understand what Russell had been trying to teach all along. 3 months after Russell's funeral, I sat at the same kitchen table where I'd opened his wooden box on Christmas morning, taking quiet inventory of everything that had shifted and everything that had not. January light cut through frost-edged windows, falling across the ceramic mug. Russell bought me 20 years ago, chipped now, but still holding heat. Outside Ohio, winter pressed gray and indifferent against a world that kept moving whether I was ready or not. The money arrived on the first of every month without fail. $8,000 split between Vernon and Renee transferred with mechanical precision. Vernon managed the furniture store competently, supplier meetings, customer relationships, everything Russell had built over decades. He called every other Sunday now, instead of weekly, asked fewer questions, offered less surveillance disguised as concern. Renee called randomly, Tuesday afternoons, Saturday mornings, shorter conversations about real things. A student who finally understood long division Iris's dinosaur obsession pot roast recipes. Not performance, just her. Howard still brought coffee twice a week, sat on the porch, even in January cold, talked about Russell in ways that made us both smile. Not happiness exactly, but dignity. In March, I signed the Morrison Construction Supply contract renewal without telling Vernon. No warning, no leverage, no negotiation. 3 days later, he called, voice shaking with something between relief and shame. Thank you, Mom, he said. You're welcome, I replied. Nothing more. Just the quiet demonstration that mercy exists but isn't guaranteed, that grace is given, never owed. A week after that January morning, all 3 children came to my house together for the first time since Simone's failed legal challenge. I produced Russell's sealed envelope from the wooden box, the private letter separate from everything Preston had read aloud in that conference room. Your father wanted you to have this, I told Vernon, holding it out. I haven't read it. Take your time. They sat at the dining table where we'd shared decades of ordinary meals and opened their father's final message while I made coffee in the kitchen and gave them space that wasn't mine to take. 15 minutes of silence, pages turning, someone clearing their throat, the particular quiet of people trying not to cry. Vernon emerged, first eyes red-rimmed, and looked at me across the counter, really looked and nodded. Brief, wordless, genuine, the first real acknowledgement in months. Simone stood by the window staring at bare January trees, left without speaking. Some people need more time. Some may never arrive. Renee cried openly, pulled me close, whispered against my shoulder. I'm sorry, Mom. Not just for the funeral. For all of it. I know, sweetheart, I said, holding her the way I had when she was small and the world felt too large. I know. That evening I sat in Russell's chair, his photograph in my hands, winter darkness settling over Westerville, and finally understood what he'd been trying to tell me that last lucid day before morphine took his clarity. He hadn't left our children a fortune. He'd left them something far more valuable and harder to accept, one final chance to choose who they wanted to become when accountability had teeth, and the person they'd tried to discard was still standing with her dignity intact. The money was only mechanism. The lesson was the inheritance. I'm still waiting to see what they do with it. And to you listening to my story, remember this. Sometimes the people who should protect you are the ones who need boundaries most. Looking back, I wish I'd seen the signs earlier. Like so many revenge stories with Mom at their heart, mine started with love that didn't ask for accountability. I wish I'd prepared myself emotionally for what my children became when money entered the picture. Don't make my mistake of assuming blood always means loyalty. Russell knew better. He saw what I couldn't bear to see. The lesson in these family revenge stories isn't about revenge at all. It's about dignity. It's about refusing to be erased just because you're older, just because you're grieving, just because your children decided you're inconvenient. Family revenge stories like mine teach us that accountability isn't cruel. It's necessary. I believe God put me through this to show that mercy without boundaries is just surrender. Russell's trust wasn't punishment. It was their last chance to choose who they wanted to be. Some took it, some didn't. But I'm still here, and I'm still standing. If you're hearing echoes of your own family revenge stories in mine, leave a comment below. You're not alone. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And if these revenge stories with Mom navigating impossible choices resonate with you, subscribe to Silent Revenge with Phoenix. Your story matters too. Thank you for staying until the very end. Remember, some details in this story have been adjusted for narrative and reflection. What matters is the lesson, and I hope it stays with you.